In a supermarket parking lot, a grown man knocked his elderly mother to the ground. People walked past. Snow kept falling. No one stopped. She curled up, arms over her head, waiting for the next kick. She didn't scream. She had learned silence the hard way. Then someone stepped forward, a retired Navy SEAL, and beside him, a German Shepherd who knew exactly what evil looked like. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter presses Spokane into a quiet restraint, snow muting sound, and slowing breath, turning an ordinary supermarket parking lot into a place where fear can briefly surface. James Walker had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself. During his years in the teams, the loud threats were almost always misdirection. The real ones arrived quietly, wrapped in familiarity, hidden inside routines people trusted. Retirement had not erased that instinct. It had only stripped it of uniform and mission, leaving it to wander places James wished it wouldn't. He stood near the far edge of the supermarket parking lot with Bear beside him, leash loose in his hand. The errand was ordinary: coffee, bread, dog food, the kind of list doctors and therapists gave men who were supposed to be adjusting. James told himself he was doing fine. He slept most nights. He didn't drink too much. He knew how to smile when cashiers spoke to him. Bear paused. The dog didn't growl or pull, didn't bare teeth or stiffen aggressively. He simply noticed. James had learned to trust that difference. Bear wasn't reacting. He was assessing. James followed the dog's attention and saw them crossing the lot ahead. An elderly woman and a man walking beside her son most likely. There was nothing overtly violent about the scene, no shouting, no striking, just a subtle imbalance. She walked half a step behind him, shoulders drawn inward, hands tight around a grocery bag, as if it were something that could keep her afloat. He moved with impatience, a short leash made of tone rather than rope. James felt his chest tighten. Fear didn't always leave marks. Sometimes it lived in posture, in the way a person avoided eye contact with the world, in how they anticipated impact that hadn't yet come. A memory surfaced uninvited. Another winter, another place. An old man standing behind his son on a dirt road, apologizing in a language James hadn't understood. James had known then, without proof, that if they left, something worse would follow. He had carried that knowledge with him ever since, a quiet weight behind the ribs. Bear shifted closer, body angled just enough to be ready. James felt the leash warm in his palm. He told himself to breathe. This was not a war zone. This was a grocery store parking lot. He didn't know these people. He didn't know their story. The man stopped abruptly. The woman nearly collided with him. He turned, said something low and sharp. James couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the cadence. Instruction dressed up as authority. Threat disguised as familiarity. The woman flinched before she could stop herself, a reflex learned over time. James hated how quickly his mind began to work, counting exits, distances, witnesses. He hated that some part of him was already building a response while another part begged him to stand down. He had promised himself he was done intervening, done carrying the weight of everyone else's choices. He had survived long enough to deserve quiet. But the quiet broke when the man's hand lifted, not to strike, not yet, but to remind. A touch meant to assert ownership. The woman folded inward, shoulders rounding, bracing for what might come next. Bear took one step forward. James didn't need to look down to know it. The dog was ready, not to attack, but to stand between. James studied the man carefully. Clean clothes, controlled movements, not drunk, not frantic. This wasn't chaos, it was practiced, familiar. That made it worse. The woman spoke again, barely audible, pleading. The man responded with a sharp shake of his head and steered her toward a car. She stumbled once on the slush. He didn't slow. James felt the old argument tear through him. "You don't know anything," one voice insisted. "This is family. This is none of your business." Another voice, colder and far more honest, answered back. "You know exactly what this is." He stayed where he was. Watching was not the same as abandoning, he told himself. Sometimes observation mattered. Sometimes timing mattered more than impulse. Still, he memorized the car, the aisle, the way the woman's hand trembled as she reached for the door. The engine started, tires spun briefly on packed snow. The car pulled away. James stood there longer than necessary, cold creeping through his boots, groceries forgotten. He told himself he had done the responsible thing, that not every battle was his to fight, that the world did not need him to keep stepping in. But as he turned toward the store entrance, he knew something inside him had shifted. A line had been drawn, not in the snow, but in memory. He had seen her now. He would not be able to unsee her. Bear leaned gently against his leg, steady and patient, as if anchoring him to the present. James rested a hand on the dog's head, not as comfort, but as acknowledgement. "Let's go," he said quietly. Inside, the supermarket buzzed with ordinary life. Carts rolled. A child laughed. Music played overhead. Everything functioned exactly as it should. Yet the image of the woman remained unresolved in James's mind. Not a victim yet, not saved, suspended in a moment that refused to end. James understood then that the beginning of something important rarely announced itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as a moment you tried to convince yourself didn't count. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside James Walker, something long buried had begun to wake. Morning light crept through frost-laced trees, winter quiet pressing in around a small cabin outside Spokane, the world reduced to wood smoke, snow, and the fragile pause that follows survival. James Walker woke to the unfamiliar weight of stillness, the kind that came after nights when adrenaline finally loosened its grip and left behind a body unsure what to do with calm. The cabin breathed softly around him, fire reduced to embers, the air holding the clean bite of cold and pine. Bear lay awake nearby, not guarding the door now, but listening to the rhythm of the room, sensing that the threat had retreated without fully disappearing. James sat up slowly, joints protesting, mind cataloging damage the way it always did, then forced himself to stop. This was not a debrief. This was the aftermath civilians lived in, where danger faded unevenly and left people to learn how to exist again. The elderly woman slept in the next room, bundled beneath blankets, her breathing shallow but steady. James had carried her in hours earlier, set her down gently, and watched exhaustion claim her faster than fear ever had. Now, in daylight, he felt the unease of proximity, the awareness that bringing her here had changed something fundamental. He had crossed from intervention into responsibility, a line he had once sworn never to cross again. He brewed coffee quietly, movements deliberate, mindful, not to startle. When she emerged, tentative, eyes scanning the space as if expecting the walls themselves to turn hostile, James kept his distance. He spoke only when necessary, offering simple facts rather than assurances he could not guarantee. She listened, absorbing safety not through words, but through the absence of pressure. Bear approached her on his own terms, slow, respectful, stopping just close enough to be present without demanding trust. James watched the moment with something like awe, recognizing how the dog understood trauma without needing it explained. The woman flinched at first, then steadied, letting her hand rest briefly against Bear's warmth, a contact that seemed to anchor her to the room. Over the next hours, quiet tasks replaced crisis. James split wood, not because it needed doing, but because rhythm helped him think. The woman sat by the window, watching snow fall without counting seconds between sounds. Bear moved between them, a living boundary that made the space feel held rather than watched. James noticed how often she startled at ordinary noises, how her shoulders rose when footsteps approached, how her gaze tracked exits by habit. He recognized all of it, the way the body remembered long after the mind wanted to forget. At one point, she apologized, the words slipping out automatically. And James felt a flash of anger, not at her, but at the reflex itself. He told her, gently but firmly, that apologies were unnecessary here. She nodded, unconvinced, and James realized then that safety was not something he could declare into existence. It had to be learned, practiced, rebuilt one small decision at a time. Later, when the sun climbed higher and the cabin warmed, James showed her simple things, not training, not tactics, but awareness. How to stand with weight balanced. How to breathe when panic crept up the spine. How to say no without raising the voice. He did not frame these as lessons, only as options, tools she could take or leave. She tried them hesitantly, surprised each time her body responded. Bear watched closely, as if memorizing her progress, his presence reinforcing each small success. James felt something unfamiliar stirring as the hours passed, not purpose exactly, but alignment, the sense that his skills still belonged to the living, not just the past. In the afternoon, she slept again, deeper this time, and James sat outside with Bear, coffee cooling in his hands. He thought about the sun, about the look he had seen when control finally failed, about how thin the line was between fear and violence. He knew law enforcement would arrive soon, that statements would be taken, that systems would grind forward. He also knew those systems rarely moved fast enough to soothe the aftermath. Inside the cabin, the woman stirred, murmuring in her sleep, and James felt the old, unwanted instinct to stand watch settle back into place. Bear rose and lay closer to the bedroom door, not at attention, but present, a silent promise shaped by loyalty. As evening approached and shadows lengthened, James realized that this chapter was not about recovery yet, but orientation, about teaching a body and mind that the world could hold without crushing. He wondered how long that lesson would take, and whether it would hold when the past came knocking again. When the woman woke near dusk, she looked steadier, eyes clearer, and asked a question that caught James off guard, not about her son or the fire or the police, but about how long it had taken James to feel normal after leaving the teams. He hesitated, then answered honestly, telling her that normal was a moving target, that safety was something you practiced, not something you earned. She nodded, absorbing that truth with a seriousness that told him she understood more than he'd expected. Outside, wind shifted through the trees, carrying distant sirens that reminded James the world had not stopped turning. He watched Bear lift his head at the sound, then relax again, trusting James's stillness. In that quiet exchange, James felt the fragile structure of the moment take shape, temporary but real, and knew that whatever came next would test it. The night would return, and with it questions that daylight could not answer. But for now, the cabin held, and that was enough to make James believe, cautiously, that survival could become something more. Snow fell harder over the supermarket parking lot, wind pushing it sideways, erasing tire tracks almost as quickly as they formed, turning the open space into a cold, exposed stage where nothing felt private anymore. James Walker stood just inside the automatic doors, warmth at his back and cold in front of him, telling himself that what he was about to do was not instinct, but choice. He could still walk away. He could still pretend the image from moments ago belonged to someone else's life. But his body had already decided before his mind caught up, the same way it used to when the line between waiting and acting collapsed into a single breath. Bear felt it too. The dog's focus sharpened, not with excitement, but with recognition, as if this moment fit an old pattern neither of them could forget. Outside, the elderly woman's son reached their car first, yanking the door open with a force that made the metal shudder. The woman lagged behind, her boots slipping slightly on the packed snow, grocery bag sagging against her leg. She said something then, louder than before, not pleading now but urgent, the kind of voice people use when they realize the next step changes everything. James caught fragments through the wind, enough to understand tone, if not words. It wasn't about milk or money, it was about stopping something. The man spun around, his patience finally snapping, and for a second, James saw it clearly, the moment where frustration tipped into permission. The slap came fast and ugly, not theatrical, just efficient, the sound dull against the winter air. The woman fell, knees hitting first, then her side, the grocery bag splitting open as cans rolled across the snow. Time slowed in the way it always did for James at moments like this, not stretching endlessly, but sharpening, edges crisp and unavoidable. Bear moved without being told, stepping forward into the space between attacker and victim, not attacking, not barking, simply occupying ground with a certainty that said this was as far as it went. The man's leg drew back, anger burning hot enough to override sense, and James felt a familiar, dangerous calm settle over him, the kind that once let him move through gunfire without thinking about the cost. He crossed the distance quickly, boots crunching loud now, voice low and steady as he spoke, not shouting, not threatening, just present. The man turned, startled, rage shifting direction as if looking for a new target, and for a heartbeat, James saw calculation there, the assessment of risk that criminals learned too late. When the kick came anyway, James intercepted it, momentum carrying both of them sideways as James redirected force rather than meeting it head-on, a lesson learned years ago in a dusty training yard. The man went down hard, breath knocked loose, anger replaced by shock. James didn't linger on him, didn't indulge the part of himself that knew exactly how far to push before something broke. He kept one knee close, one hand ready, his attention split between the man on the ground and the woman struggling to sit up, her face pale, eyes wide with a mix of fear and something worse, shame. Bear stayed planted between them, watching the man with a focus that spoke of long memory and old commands, waiting for permission that never came. Around them, car doors slammed, someone shouted, another voice fumbled for a phone. James felt the weight of witnesses settle over him like new snow, each one a reminder that this was not a battlefield, that every movement now carried consequences measured in reports and statements rather than survival. The man swore, scrambling to his feet, pointing, already reshaping the story in his head, while James backed away half a step, palms open, his breathing controlled. He told himself again that this was not his job anymore, that he had crossed the line he had promised himself he wouldn't. Yet, when he looked at the woman, still on the ground, hands shaking as she tried to gather spilled groceries, he knew the truth was simpler and harder. Some lines redraw themselves no matter how carefully you avoid them. Sirens cut through the wind, then, distant but approaching. And the man's anger shifted into something sharper, more dangerous in its own way. He reached for the woman's arm as if to pull her up, to reclaim control before uniforms arrived, and James stepped between them again, this time without touching, just standing there, eyes level, unmoving. The woman looked up at him then, really looked, and in that brief second, James saw the depth of her fear, not of him or the dog or even the police, but of what would happen later, when the parking lot was empty and winter closed back in. The sirens grew louder. Bear stayed still. James felt the old, bitter understanding settle in his chest. This moment was not an ending. It was a fracture, the first visible crack in something that had been breaking for a long time, and as flashing lights washed over the snow, James knew that whatever came next would not be decided here, but somewhere colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. Police lights turned the falling snow blue and red, reflecting off windshields and ice, flattening the supermarket parking lot into a harsh, exposed space where truth felt less solid than the ground beneath their feet. James Walker stood a few steps back from the patrol cars, hands loose at his sides, posture deliberately unthreatening, aware that every instinct screaming inside him now had to be folded away. This was the part he had never learned to like, even overseas. The part after movement stopped when noise gave way to questions and answers mattered more than intent. Bear remained close, calm but alert, not because he sensed danger now, but because he sensed uncertainty, the kind that could turn sharp without warning. The officers moved efficiently, separating people, voices clipped and procedural, their presence instantly shifting the balance of power. James watched the elderly woman as she was helped to her feet. She moved slowly, more shaken than injured, brushing snow from her coat with hands that would not quite steady. When an officer spoke to her, she nodded too quickly, eyes dropping, shoulders curling inward, as if bracing for impact that was no longer there. James recognized that posture. He had seen it in civilians caught between militias, in informants standing beside the very men they feared. It was not confusion. It was calculation, born of survival. The son spoke next, animated, controlled in a different way now, anger tempered by awareness. He gestured toward James, then toward Bear, shaping a narrative where he was provoked, misunderstood, embarrassed in public. James listened without interrupting, knowing that denial here would sound defensive, knowing also that the truth rarely won on first contact. When an officer turned to him, James answered simply, offering facts without emotion, choosing restraint over righteousness. He felt strangely distant from his own voice, as if he were listening to someone else explain why they had stepped forward when it would have been easier to stay still. The questions circled back to the woman. Had she been struck? Did she feel threatened? Did she need medical attention? James watched her face tighten at each one, watched fear flicker behind her eyes, not fear of the officers, but of what their attention might cost her later. He wanted to speak then, to say something that would give her cover, but he knew better. He knew that taking her agency now, even with good intentions, would only replace one form of control with another. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin but clear. She said she had slipped. She said the fall had startled everyone. She said her son had only been trying to help her up. The words landed like dull impacts in James's chest. He did not look at the son, but he felt the shift, the release of tension, the way victory could arrive quietly, too. The officers exchanged a glance, disappointment barely hidden, procedure reasserting itself. Without a complaint, there was little else to do. James felt the weight of that familiar injustice, the kind that did not announce itself as wrong, but hid inside rules written for cleaner situations. The woman's gaze lifted then, just briefly, and met James's. In that moment he saw apology there, and something like pleading, not for him to fix this, but for him to understand why she could not. He understood too well. Years ago he had watched men walk away from deals they knew were poison because the alternative felt worse. Survival made liars of people who hated lying. As the officers wrapped up, one of them warned the son to keep his temper in check, the words formal and empty. The son nodded, compliant now, already thinking ahead. James knew that look too, the look of someone counting the minutes until witnesses disappeared. Bear shifted closer to James, sensing the unresolved tension, his presence a quiet counterpoint to the noise of radios and engines. When the officers finally turned back toward their cars, James felt an unexpected heaviness settle over him. This was the ending most people accepted, the kind that let everyone go home believing order had been restored. He watched the woman gather what groceries she could salvage, her movements careful, almost apologetic, as if the spill itself were her fault. The son hovered close, too close, hand ready to guide, to steer. James made a decision then, small and deliberate. As the officers finished paperwork a few steps away, James moved just enough to cross the woman's path, not blocking, not drawing attention. He spoke softly, words meant only for her. He did not tell her what to do. He did not promise safety. He offered something simpler. He pressed a folded slip of paper into her hand, quick and unnoticed, his number written there and a single word beneath it, safe. Not as instruction, but as possibility. Her fingers closed around it instantly, reflexive, practiced, hiding it from view. She did not look at him again, but James saw the smallest change in her breathing, as if some pressure had eased just a fraction. The son's voice cut in, sharp, impatient, and she flinched, returning to her place beside him. James stepped back, letting distance reassert itself. He knew the limits of what he had done, knew that a piece of paper could not stand against fear on its own. Yet, as they walked away, James felt a strange certainty take hold. This story was not finished. It had only shifted locations, moving from public cold into private darkness, where consequences would come due. Bear glanced up at him, as if asking whether this was over. James did not answer. He watched the car disappear into falling snow and felt the familiar, unwelcome knowledge settle in his bones. He had been here before. The most dangerous moments were never the ones with sirens. They were the ones that came after, when everyone believed the crisis had passed. Night settled hard over Spokane, snow crusted and unmoving, the quiet of winter pressing against houses and backyards alike, turning small structures like sheds and garages into places where sound could vanish without being noticed. James Walker woke before his phone vibrated, the way he often did when something in the air shifted before logic could catch up. He lay still for a moment, listening to the cabin breathe around him, Bear already alert at his side, not restless, not anxious, just awake with purpose. The phone buzzed again, short and insistent, and James reached for it knowing, with an unpleasant certainty, that the thin line he had offered days ago had finally been crossed. The voice on the other end was the elderly woman's, barely audible, compressed by fear and cold. She did not explain at first. She did not need to. James heard the tightness in her breathing, the way words arrived broken, as if each one had to fight past something physical to exist. She told him she was locked inside the shed behind her son's house, that it was dark, that the door had been bolted from the outside. She told him there was money in the house now, money she did not recognize, and a gun she had never seen before. She said her son had been drinking, had been talking too fast, had accused her of trying to ruin everything. James listened, saying little, anchoring her with his voice, the way he once anchored panicked teammates pinned down under fire. Bear pressed closer, sensing the shift, the move from waiting to action. James asked where the shed was, how far from the house, whether she was hurt. She said no, not yet, and that word landed heavy. Not yet meant she knew what came next if nothing changed. As he pulled on boots and a jacket, James felt the old machinery inside him turn over, efficient and cold. He hated how familiar it felt. He hated how part of him was relieved to have clarity again. The drive through snow-choked streets felt longer than it was, headlights tunneling through darkness, James's mind assembling possibilities he did not want to consider. He remembered another locked space years ago, a storage room in a compound where a woman had hidden while men argued about what to do with her. He remembered arriving too late then, remembered the silence after. He would not be late again. When he parked down the street from the address she'd given him, James cut the engine and listened. The neighborhood slept, unaware, windows dark, the kind of place where people assumed winter itself kept them safe. Bear waited for the signal, muscles coiled, not with aggression, but intent. James moved quietly through the yard, snow crunching softly underfoot, the shed visible now as a low, shadowed shape at the edge of the property. From inside came a sound that tightened his chest, a muffled cough, followed by the scrape of movement against wood. He tapped once, twice, a rhythm he'd given her earlier over the phone, and heard her answer with a single knock, weak but present. James whispered reassurance through the door, telling her to stay back, to stay low. From the house came raised voices, her son arguing with someone on the phone, words sharp with desperation and entitlement. James understood then that the situation had escalated beyond family violence into something more volatile. This was not just anger anymore. It was fear turned outward, the kind that made people do unforgivable things. He worked the bolt quietly, tools minimal, movements practiced, the door opening just enough for him to slip inside and guide her out. She was shaking hard now, cold and shock combining, but her eyes were clear, fixed on his face with a trust that felt heavier than any oath. Bear positioned himself behind them instinctively, blocking the line of sight from the house. As James led her away, the door to the house slammed open and her son's voice cut through the night, calling her name not with concern but command. James did not answer. He moved faster, guiding her toward the fence line, every sense tuned to the space between them and danger. A shot rang out then, wild and panicked, splintering wood somewhere behind them. Bear reacted instantly, not chasing, not attacking, but placing himself between sound and woman, absorbing threat the way he had been trained to do long before James ever met him. They reached the fence just as shouting erupted behind them, confusion replacing control. James did not look back. He lifted the woman over the fence and followed, landing hard but steady, already moving toward the street where his truck waited. Sirens wailed in the distance, not yet close enough, but coming. As James bundled the woman into the cab, wrapping her in a blanket, he felt the tremor in his hands he had kept at bay finally surface. This had crossed a line that could not be stepped back over. Whatever happened next would be permanent. As he drove, the woman's breathing slowly steadied, and she spoke, not in apology now, but in something like resolve. She told him she had called because she was afraid her son would go too far, because loving him no longer meant protecting him from consequences. James listened, eyes fixed on the road, knowing that this decision would cost her more than anyone else would ever understand. When he glanced at the rearview mirror, he saw Bear watching the dark behind them, unwavering, guarding against a past that was already catching fire, and James knew the night was far from over. Firelight flickered against falling snow. The night split between heat and cold, turning the yard behind the house into a place where every decision carried the weight of no return. James Walker felt the shift before he saw it. The way chaos always announced itself through absence first, the absence of restraint, of reason, of any remaining line the son had promised himself he would not cross. The shed door stood open behind them now, a dark mouth exhaling smoke as flames climbed along stacked wood and spilled fuel, the fire not yet roaring, but eager, alive, waiting to be fed. The elderly woman stumbled, knees buckling, shock finally overtaking adrenaline, and James caught her without thinking, steadying her weight as Bear circled close, alert not to the fire, but to the man pacing several yards away with a gun clutched too tightly to be safe. James's mind narrowed, the world compressing into distance, timing, angles, the same cold math he had once trusted with his life. He heard the son shouting, words slurred by panic and pride, accusing his mother of betrayal, of choosing a stranger over blood, and James felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with tactics. He saw then what the woman had already understood in the shed, that this was no longer about control or fear, but about the son's terror of losing the future he had imagined for himself, even if that future was built on crime. The gun came up, not aimed yet, but close enough to make the threat undeniable, and James positioned himself without touching the woman, just enough to block the line of fire, his voice calm even, cutting through the noise like a hand on a shoulder. He spoke the son's name once, not as a challenge, but as an anchor, reminding him that this moment still had a choice inside it. The son laughed, sharp and brittle, and the sound carried no humor at all. Fire crackled louder then, heat pushing outward, and James smelled burning plastic, knew the shed would go fast if no one stopped it. Bear stood firm at James's side, not growling, not advancing, simply present, a silent warning shaped by loyalty and old training. The son took a step forward, then another, rage and fear spiraling together, and James understood with absolute clarity that waiting any longer would mean losing control of the situation entirely. He moved decisively, closing distance at an angle that forced the gun hand wide, redirecting rather than striking, his grip firm but controlled, muscle memory guiding him through a sequence he had hoped never to use again. The gun discharged into the night, the sound tearing through the yard, but the bullet found only empty air. Bear surged forward then, not to attack, but to occupy space, to break momentum, his presence enough to force the son to stumble back. James disarmed him in the same motion, sending the weapon skidding across snow and ice, then drove the son to the ground, pinning him just long enough to make the message clear. He did not hit him, he did not punish him. He held him there, face to face, letting the son see something colder than anger in his eyes, something final. When James released him, the son scrambled away, coughing, stunned, his bravado burned down to nothing. Sirens grew louder now, close enough to matter, and the fire leapt higher, forcing James to turn back to the woman. She had sunk to her knees near the fence, shaking violently, breath coming in short, broken pulls, eyes fixed not on the flames, but on the man she had raised. James knelt beside her, speaking softly, grounding her in the present, and when she could not stand, he lifted her without hesitation, cradling her weight as the fire roared behind them. Snow melted against his jacket, steam rising where heat met cold, and James felt the strange clarity that sometimes followed violence, the certainty that this path, once chosen, could not be abandoned halfway. As he carried her toward the truck, Bear stayed close, guarding their retreat, senses locked outward, refusing to look back. The woman pressed her face against James's shoulder then, her voice breaking as she spoke words he would remember long after the fire died. She said she had called him not because she wanted her son punished, but because she could no longer save him by staying silent. James said nothing, knowing there was nothing adequate to say. As they drove away, flames reflecting in the rearview mirror like a warning rather than a victory, James felt the full weight of what had begun to settle in. This was no longer a single act of intervention. This was a crossing. Whatever waited in the chapters ahead would be shaped by this night, by fire, by choice, and by a mother who had finally decided that love sometimes meant letting the truth burn its way into the open. Late winter loosened its grip on Spokane, snow thinning into wet streets and pale sunlight, as the city returned to its routines while quiet reckonings unfolded behind courthouse doors and in small, hidden rooms where fear once lived. James Walker stood outside the courthouse with Bear beside him, the cold no longer biting, but lingering just enough to remind him how close everything still was. The building behind them absorbed sound, swallowing voices, footsteps, outcomes, reducing lives to documents and decisions that would outlast memory. Inside, the elderly woman sat alone in a narrow room, hands folded in her lap, waiting to be called. James had offered to sit with her, but she had shaken her head gently, not out of fear this time, but resolve. This part, she said quietly, she needed to do standing on her own feet. James respected that more than he knew how to say. When the door finally opened and her name was called, he felt the familiar urge to move, to follow, to shield, and forced himself to remain still. Bear sensed the tension, not reacting, not straining, simply staying close, a steady presence that reminded James he did not have to act to be useful. Time passed unevenly, stretching and compressing the way it did when stakes were real. James thought about the son, now in custody, stripped of the bravado that had once passed for power. He did not feel triumph at that thought, only a heavy sadness, the kind reserved for futures that collapsed under their own weight. He thought, too, about his own past, the men he had lost, the missions that ended with flags and silence, and how often justice had arrived late or not at all. When the woman emerged, her face was drawn but calm, Something settled behind her eyes that James had not seen before. She told him it was over, not because everything was healed, but because the truth had finally been spoken where it mattered. Charges would stand. Consequences would follow. She did not say whether that hurt more than the violence itself, but James understood that love and loss often shared the same space. They returned to the cabin that evening, not as refuge now, but as transition. The woman packed slowly, deliberately, each movement measured, as if learning how to occupy space without permission. James did not hover. He made coffee, fed Bear, fixed a hinge that had been loose for years, small acts that grounded him while she gathered herself. When she was ready to leave, she did not rush. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking out at the trees, the snow retreating at their roots, and then turned to James with a softness that carried no apology. She thanked him, not with excess or ceremony, but with a clarity that told him she understood the cost of what he had done. James shook his head, uncomfortable with gratitude, and told her the truth as simply as he could. He said he had been too late once, long ago, and that sometimes saving one person was how you made peace with those you could not save. She nodded, accepting that, without trying to fix it. Before she left, James handed her a small object he had carried for years, a simple whistle on a cord, the kind meant to cut through noise when voices failed. He told her it was not a promise that he would always arrive in time, but a reminder that she was no longer alone, that help existed beyond silence. She closed her fingers around it, understanding the weight of symbols better than most. Bear approached her then, calm and deliberate, and she knelt, resting her forehead briefly against his, a gesture that held gratitude without words. When she drove away, James watched until the road curved out of sight, feeling the ache that came when purpose shifted again. The days that followed were quiet. The cabin returned to its rhythms, but something inside James had changed. He slept differently now, dreams less crowded by unfinished moments. He found himself standing straighter, breathing deeper, not because the world had grown safer, but because he had remembered how to choose when it mattered. Bear remained at his side, not guarding against shadows now, but walking with the easy confidence of something that knew its place. Weeks later, as spring hinted at arrival, James received a letter forwarded from the courthouse, short and careful. The woman had moved into a small apartment closer to town, had begun attending meetings, had planted herbs on a windowsill that caught the afternoon sun. She wrote that she was learning how to live without shrinking, that some days were harder than others, but that she no longer mistook fear for love. James folded the letter and placed it beside the hearth, not as a trophy, but as a marker. That evening he took Bear for a long walk through melting snow, boots sinking into soft earth, the forest opening in quiet acknowledgement. James did not think about what came next in terms of missions or futures. He thought instead about presence, about the simple, radical act of standing between harm and the vulnerable when the moment called for it, and knowing when to step back afterward. As dusk settled and the first stars appeared, James felt a rare sense of closure, not the kind that erased scars, but the kind that allowed them to exist without ruling the body. He and Bear turned back toward the cabin, light glowing in the windows. And for the first time in a long while, James Walker walked forward without looking over his shoulder, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that redemption did not always arrive with victory, but sometimes with the courage to tell the truth and let it stand. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder from the sky or light breaking through the clouds. Sometimes the miracle is a single moment when someone chooses to stand between cruelty and the vulnerable. Sometimes it is the courage to speak the truth after years of silence. And sometimes it is simply surviving long enough to begin again. God does not always remove the storm from our lives, but He often sends shelter into it. A stranger, a loyal companion, a moment of clarity when fear no longer gets the final word. In our daily lives, we may never wear a uniform or face danger as dramatic as this story, but we are all given chances to notice suffering, to act with compassion, and to choose courage over comfort. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and let us know where you are watching from or what this story meant to you. And if you believe that kindness still matters in a world that often feels cold, please subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach those who need them. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you in quiet moments and difficult ones alike. May He give you the strength to see, the courage to act, and the peace to heal. Amen.